We can all think of depraved crimes from movies, but that is where it ends for us. They are simply fictitious. But some bring these horrors to life in such a disturbing way that the details are often lost to history. But as these 3 examples will show, the nightmares are real. Not many people know about Ed Gein for who he was, because he did not fill the conventional role of serial killer. This is because he officially only had 2 victims, but the crimes were so heinous I had to include him. Ed Gein was born in 1906 and grew up living in Wisconsin. His mother tried her best to isolate Ed and his brother from the outside world as much as possible. She taught them that any other women they would encounter were prostitutes and were corrupted by the devil. Ed was picked on significantly growing up and had very poor social skills. Over time, his family members died one by one, and eventually he was left in his farmhouse all alone. By 1947, Gein started visiting the local cemetery at night and digging up graves. After that, he would bring the corpses back to his house for his own purposes. This went on for years, until it was all uncovered in 1957, when Gein murdered Bernice Worden, who worked at a local store. There was a paper trail that led directly back to him. Upon searching his house, the police discovered a nightmarish display that movies can barely compete with. In the shed, they found Worden's headless body hung upside down, but that wasn't even half of it. Upon searching the rest of the house, they found 4 different noses, 9 masks made from human skin, 10 bowls made from the skulls of 10 women, chairs covered in human skin, the heads of Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden, skulls on the bed frame, a fridge full of organs, a belt made from human female nipples. Yeah, you heard me right. And a lampshade made from the skin of a human face. Apparently, Gein wanted to recreate his mother's presence as much as possible, which, for him, meant making a suit out of the skin and faces of human cadavers so that he could wear it and pretend to be female. Gein wasn't tried immediately, as he spent a long stretch of time in a mental facility. Once he finally stood trial, he was sentenced to life in a psychiatric facility until he died in 1984. Gein has inspired several different movie villains, including Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs, Norman Bates from Psycho, and Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
John Wayne Gacy was born in 1926 and had a childhood tainted with issues with his father, a concussion that caused him a blood clot in his brain, and a mysterious heart condition that caused him inexplicable amounts of pain. He was unable to get through high school, despite transferring multiple times. Eventually, Gacy moved to Las Vegas to work, and returned to Chicago to work even further. It is also well known that he worked as a clown, which led to his reputation as a killer clown. In 1968, Gacy was convicted of binding and sexually assaulting a teenage boy. Several months later, it came to light that Gacy had hired a young man to attack his victim, most likely for intimidation purposes. Of course, the plan backfired and just led to heavier charges. He was psychologically evaluated, but while they concluded he had an antisocial personality, they determined he would not benefit from psychiatric treatment, and he received the maximum sentence for his charges. While he was serving his 10-year prison sentence, his wife divorced him. That being said, Gacy was described as a model prisoner, and he was paroled after only 18 months. His mother helped him find a new house to live in, and he tried to get his life back together. That being said, he forced another teenage boy to perform sexual acts on him, but this time he managed to slip through the system without being charged. Despite this, Gacy remarried soon after. By 1972, their new life was underway, but his wife was constantly aware of a rancid stench that was coming up from beneath the floorboards, but Gacy brushed the matter aside. Within 3 years, Gacy's second marriage was falling apart. His wife began finding pornographic magazines centered around men and younger boys, and his mood became erratic and uncontrollable. Gacy also stopped sleeping properly, which made things even worse. All of these things led to his second wife filing for divorce. Over the next few years, many teenage boys who were acquainted with Gacy began disappearing. After a long investigation in 1978, Gacy confessed to the rape and murder of 30 teenage boys, and he had buried the vast majority of them in the crawl space under his house. The other bodies were dumped into a river near his house. All in all, the body count was 33 people. Multiple medical experts testified that Gacy suffered from a combination of mental illnesses that essentially boiled down to the fact that he did not understand the severity of his crimes at the time he was committing them. Despite this defense, John Wayne Gacy was convicted of 33 murders and was put to death in 1994.
From the start, Albert Fish was an incredibly extreme sadomasochist. He simply loved inflicting and receiving pain. This actually began in his childhood, which he spent at an orphanage and witnessed massive amounts of abuse. But it wasn't until Fish grew up, married, and began raising a family that things started to escalate. In 1917, his wife ran off with another man, and his behavior seemed to grow stranger and stranger. He encouraged his own children and the children of his neighbors to paddle him until he bled. It is worth pointing out that this paddle was covered in nails over an inch long. He also inserted multiple needles throughout his body, particularly in his genitals, and left them there for long periods of time. He wrote extremely profane letters to widows asking them to paddle and torture him further. Apparently, these letters were so obscene that the prosecution refused to make them public. On the full moon, Fish would always consume massive amounts of raw meat. He also began researching cannibalism to such extents that he would not leave his house without the articles with him. By the time Albert Fish was caught, he confessed to 6 murders that he committed at different locations around the country. He murdered an adult man in Delaware, but also kidnapped several children and tortured them to death, including a mentally handicapped boy. But most knew him for when he kidnapped Grace Budd and was not caught for many years. He was able to gain access to the young girl by persuading her family to trust him to take her to a birthday party that his sister was throwing. Of course, this was an elaborate lie, and Grace was never seen again. 6 years into the search for Grace, the Budd family received a letter from a mysterious Captain Davis, who described how he enjoyed eating the flesh of children and had kidnapped Grace to carry on his habit. He explained in horrific detail how he allowed her to play in the backyard while he removed all his clothing. When she returned, he violently strangled her. The letter went on to graphically describe how he cooked and ate pieces of her flesh and drank her blood, but assured the parents that he had never sexually assaulted her. For some reason, this was a very important point for him to make. It was through this letter that the police finally apprehended him. A long trial ensued, and even though a psychiatrist declared him insane, he was still executed by the electric chair in 1936. Apparently, he was so excited for his violent death that he even helped the guards fasten his restraints. The statements he made before his execution were so obscene that the guards refused to ever show them to anyone.